And we are live. Another founder wisdom pod with someone that I really appreciate here. His name is Christopher Flis. He was patient enough with me because I'm always late and I missed the last one. So it tells a lot about his character. Christopher flies, aka because Chris flew jets back in the days in the military. Nowadays, he's a financial planner and founded Resilient Asset Management. He's also the owner of CDF Capital Management, CDF Properties. So it has a lot of investments. His parents had a couple of Burger Kings, and he's also a Burger King franchisee. So he has all of these sources of income, which will make the convo really interesting today. I really look up to Chris when it comes to wealth and financial management. So Chris, I'm glad to have you on. Podcast brought to you by podpire.com. If you want to start, scale, or be invited to a podcast, that is my podcasting company, podpire.com. Chris, can you tell us a bit more about yourself and what you're up to nowadays?
Yeah, I live in Memphis, Tennessee. I retired here in 2016 from the U.S. Navy. Was in the Navy for 21 years. About half to 2/3 of the time I was flying, and the balance of the time I was doing non-flying stuff. Lived all around the world in Australia, Guam, and Japan for 6 years, and finally settled back here in Memphis. I grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas, which is where the Burger Kings that you mentioned before are all located. And then that's only about 2 hours away. So I'm here. My sister lives here with us, or not with us, in the same city. And we've been here for about 10 years now, and founded the firm in 2016 for financial planning.
Love it. And as you mentioned, Burger King, I have a Whopper Junior and chicken nuggets going on in my head. I'm fasting today, so thank you for that.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it's so delicious, a Whopper. Let's start with your background. I mean, you've been all over the world. You and I, last time we spoke about Japanese folks hiding in holes after the Second World War. I read a couple of Wikipedia articles on folks that hid there and became hermits for 30 years, which is super impressive and fascinating. You've been in Australia. What have you learned from your time in the military, one, and two, from traveling and living throughout so many cultures out there?
Well, the military, it's a great. I was only in the military for a very brief period of time before 9/11 happened, and the pre 9/11 military is much different than the post 9/11 military. We were the first ship to go to Hong Kong in 2000, which was now I don't know that the ships even go there anymore. That was very interesting, and how Hong Kong changed just from that 2000 until the last time I was there in 2010. But just different cultures, how much the U.S. has appreciated, around the world, and the impact that the U.S. has throughout the world for all the different, strategic objectives that it's trying to learn. But the other part are the, cultural stuff. There are a lot of uniqueness. There's a lot of uniqueness to every culture. There's also like a lot of similarity. People appreciate people who are forthright, good, people. Those are traits that are unique across all the cultures. So that there's a lot, but that probably is the pretty good summary.
Right, and these cultures. So, I'm curious first, what have you seen in Hong Kong? Because I was there in 2015. I wasn't there before. But what have you seen change in Hong Kong in that time?
Yeah, when I was there in 2000, I mean, there was a certain vibe or aliveness to the entire culture. It was very entrepreneurial. Street markets, vendors, people doing all kinds of interesting stuff. Tailors, people just really making their way. And you thought, man, these people are on the cusp of the next. They're going to be carrying the torch. And that was, I believe the handover was in 1997. So I was there just shortly thereafter. Fast forward, 10 years, you go back and it's a lot of designer brands, Rolex and Hermes, and that has sort of taken over the landscape quite substantially. I can't speak too much about the political part, just more of just how the vibe was considerably different. Not that it was any less entrepreneurial. It's just it was a different kind of thing.
Right. What did you learn from flying jets?
Oh, that was great. Well, if you want if you want to be a financial planner and you want to be a fighter pilot, that has to happen in a very specific order. So I got the fighter pilot one first, and it was probably the most important thing that I learned was how to prioritize things. When you're flying by yourself and you're doing a host of things in the cockpit, and remember, we're not just flying from point A to point B. There's a mission that's involved, and that has a lot of constituent parts. So being able to prioritize those things is a skill that you have to learn to be successful. And I carry that over into every aspect of my life, to include the financial planning firm.
Right. And you were there when this tsunami hit Japan. What stress and crisis management lessons did you learn from that?
Yeah, that was interesting. I was in my boss's office on a Friday afternoon, and you got tremors every now and then, but this was a prolonged one where you could actually see things moving. It was a pretty bizarre thing. And it was literally Friday at the end of the workday. Typically at the end of the workday, we'd go to the club afterwards. Well, we didn't realize at the moment the severity of what had happened, but in the few hours after that, things started to come to light about how serious that it was. So that was on Friday afternoon, and then by Saturday afternoon, I was one of the folks who was chosen to go down and work with the Japanese joint staff, their equivalent of the higher echelon of the military. It was like a liaison position, so that we would work at the U.S. post there directly with the Japanese folks, and that was obviously a national emergency. And they over time, we didn't know at the beginning, like with most crises, what the extent of it was going to be, and it turned out it wasn't quite as bad as something like Chernobyl, but at the time it was a very serious thing. There was probably a couple anxious weeks there, but that was just more of an interesting thing to actually embed with a foreign force rather than having a national crisis. It was very, very palpable working with the Japanese about how severe the situation was.
That's a pretty big tsunami as well. I believe it was 40 meters in some places, and it must have been devastating. Their little wall protecting their nuclear facility was definitely not enough to withstand that. What caught my attention with that was that they deployed, robots at some point to help clear the debris. Not sure how effective that was via humans. It took them a while to clear the full debris, right?
Yeah, we had all kinds, and that's another interesting part about those crises is all these defense contractors, the Lockheeds, the Boeings, they have all these experimental things that they can sell you to go fix the problem. That's been done. But there's also a lot of existing military stuff. Like, for example, the U.S. Air Force has the capability of creating effectively a airport wherever they want in a short period of time. So they were able to do that. And just the amount of the U.S. was obviously helping, and that was probably most impressive to me about the whole thing. It's just the amount of infrastructure and the resources that the U.S. can bring to bear when they decide to address a problem is quite extraordinary, both at the equipment and also the human capital level. But it was a very interesting thing. And I think even now they're collecting all the water, and they're going to start emptying some of it into the ocean. I just was reading about that, this morning. So that'll be interesting to see how that whole thing, plays out.
Right. And then, so you were in the military, you saved up a bunch of money, and then you started investing that into properties and into stocks and so forth. And you also decided to advise people at the same time, specifically folks from the U.S. forces, right?
Right. So when I was in high school, I had a very savvy, very impactful principal, and one of his things he decided to do for the graduating class when I was in high school was to give us a class on, or have a financial planner come in and give us a talk about how to manage your finances. And she was a financial planner, and she had a company called Money Magic. And I had known about money, basically spending it up to that point, but that was the first time I was ever introduced to the concept of compounding interest. And what I found over my life is that when you see, when you hear and that's explained to you, or the light comes on for compounding, for compound interest, you're either immediately inoculated with it and you're mesmerized by it, or it just kind of doesn't really ring true. It's either kind of 100 or 0. There's not a lot of in between. Well, I was one of the 100, folks, and that sparked a passion with me for saving and investing and wealth, generation, from that point. And when I went to college at the Naval Academy, you're actually paid a salary while you're going to school. It's very meager, or at least it was then. And I was actually able to save $25 a month, $50 a month, $75 a month, and $100 a month, all during my time at the academy. And that just sparked the whole savings sort of deal. And then I knew around the time the second time I was in Japan that my naval career was going to come to an end in probably the 2016 timeframe. So that's when I started taking the formal coursework to become a financial planner. But in that time, when my parents both passed away in 2009 and 2011, my siblings and I gained control of the family business, and that exposed me to many things about financial planning, estate planning, different retirement things, business stuff, borrowing. So my experience with all the things about which I advise clients is actual, not just theoretical from that academic literature.
Right, and you have multiple sources of income. Real estate is conservative, stocks a bit less depending on where you invest. And I mean, if you invest in a Vanguard, sure. What strategy do you advise folks in terms of money? Is it the classic, are you a high risk taker or a low risk taker? Like, what insights can you give us on how to manage one's wealth?
Well, it certainly depends on your situation. The folks with whom I work, some about half or a bit more have a military pension. So retirement planning for that kind of individual is dramatically different than if you don't have a pension. When you have, like when I started my financial planning firm, when you retire from the military and I was in my early 40s, you have medical care, you have a government pension coming in every month. That really lets you focus on the work and not so much on having to generate revenue, right away. So I was able to grow the way that I wanted to rather than the way that I needed to when I started. So to answer your question, it really depends on the situation. If you're a government employee who has really steady income and your employment is relatively certain, then maybe you're a person who can take a lot more risk because your income is going to be more stable. Whereas if you're someone who's in sales, whose income is going to fluctuate, dramatically from year to year, then your volatility is with your employment rather than with your investments. So those people would have different postures. And the other part, and this is I've learned as the firm has kind of grown over the years, is you kind of have to, when you get older, you have to decide how much is enough, because you don't want, if you get to a certain level of wealth, you don't want to jeopardize that by taking too much risk, because your number of years you have to make up for that are not as great as they were when you were younger. So the classic answer to the question is, it depends. But generally speaking, I tend to be pretty aggressive with investments for people who have adequate means.
Are you still bullish on franchises like Burger King?
Franchising is it's interesting. You have a brand and you're able to use all the trademarks with the brand, but now you're beholden to the brand to do things the way that they want. And the quality of the franchisor has a lot to do with how the franchisee experience is. So with our brand, Burger King, the leadership has changed and evolved. It's evolved and it's changed a lot over the years. So we've had a lot of different posture from the franchisor. But in general, fast food franchising can be very, very lucrative depending on where your territory is and what your brand is. And what I found is that the more continuity there is at the leadership level of the franchisor, the better the experience is for the franchisees, generally speaking.
About real estate, like I'm not super bullish on real estate. I'm a high risk taker, and I think I can invest that cash into businesses, especially of my own, or businesses that I know at least that I evaluated with a grid of criterias, plus my gut. In the end, is always the gut that makes the final decision. Is my profile right to invest in real estate? Should I still have a cash cushion if I don't care about having cash cushions?
Well, I think real estate, I think it's a good asset, but I think it's somewhat overrated because there's a lot of capital obviously has to be involved in. Typically, that involves borrowing, but it depends how you participate in your real estate. In our world, in the fast food world, net lease investors. So we build the Burger King. We might have a landlord who's a third party. They're just getting a check in the mail every month, and they're happy to have no involvement whatsoever. That is a certain kind of investor, typically not a very entrepreneurial one. Whereas someone who wants to buy vacant land and develop it into something, whether it be a restaurant or an apartment complex or what have you, that's a little bit more speculative and entrepreneurial. But on balance, I think your returns for entrepreneurial stuff, where you're investing directly into a business or in a stock or publicly traded company, I think you're opening the returns you can get a little bit wider. But with real estate, you do always have a backstop that if things don't work out, you've at least got the land or the building, perhaps that can mitigate some of the losses that you would experience.
Right. And last but not least, stocks. Stock market has been exploding in the 2020s, especially tech stocks. This year is kind of quiet, right? What is your outlook on this market right now, and how should that dictate some of my moves with my money?
Yeah, so predictions on where market's going is something I think is kind of a fool's errand. What I try and do is try to evaluate where things are today, because if we don't know where we are, we certainly aren't going to know where we're going to get to. Over the past decade or so, what we've seen is that I think the biggest disparity is in international stocks versus U.S. Domestic stocks. That mismatch between the returns has been pretty broad. Within the U.S. space, the higher growth names that we recognize, the Alphabets, Facebook, Meta, those kind of things, those have experienced tremendous growth, whereas the value or the more what I call maybe steadier stocks, dividend payer kind of things, they have experienced less there. So I think, broadly speaking, over the long term, markets will do well. In today's environment, I think the international emerging has been very, very lagging compared to the U.S., and that might be a place to look for value these days. And then in the U.S. space, the more value-driven stocks might be a place to have a look.
Nice, Chris. Thanks so much for sharing that value. Where can people find out more about you?
Yeah, easiest place is the website, www.resilientam.com, or LinkedIn. You can just search on my name. There's not too many Flisses out there. Or you can call. We always like to call. Or if you're in Memphis, we're still waiting for the person to randomly knock on the door who wants to become a client. We haven't had it happen yet, but we're waiting patiently.
Welcome. I'm Charles Cormier, host of the founderwisdompodcast.com. If you want to start, scale, or be invited to podcast, that would be Podpire.